So, review video number 2, Absolutism in Eastern Europe, 1600 to 1740. Make sure you pay attention to the differences between absolutism in Western Europe and that in Eastern Europe. This is covering what Group 2 and 3 researched and presented, and just making sure that hit all of the highlights there. So, a good mnemonic code or an easy way to remember this section is hop wrap. So you have 3 aging empires that are going to give way to new empires. And so your aging empires are hop, the ones that are going to fade away. And that's the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Kingdom. And that's going to give way to the new rising empires of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, which is your wrap. So hop wrap. So we're going to cover just briefly some background information on our aging empires and then move into our new empires. So first, the Holy Roman Empire. If you remember the religious divisions we talked about in the Reformation and then those religious wars that followed in the 16th and 17th centuries had split the Holy Roman Empire or Germany among Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist princes, so into those 300 different autonomous principalities. So after 1648, they're all split up. Then the Ottoman Empire, which we had seen very expansionist, could not maintain its possessions in Eastern Europe and the Balkans in the face of Austrian and Russian expansion, which we're going to discuss very thoroughly here in this section. They have been the most powerful in the 16th century and have been built on expansion. If you remember, the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire had absolute power, and after 1560, however, the decline in Western expansion in the Ottoman Empire is going to result in the gradual disintegration of the empire. Suleiman the Magnificent is probably the ruler you need to remember the most for the Ottoman Empire. He ruled from 1520 to 1566 and was perhaps the most powerful ruler in the world during the 16th century. He had nearly conquered Austria in 1529, had captured Belgrade or Serbia, captured nearly half of the Eastern Europe, including all the Balkan territories and most of Hungary and part of southern Russia. And it is under Suleiman the Magnificent that the Muslims are going to begin to run into Christians and take over these Christian lands. And since their empire got so big, the Ottoman Empire, they needed to take intelligent individuals to train them to be in the bureaucracy. And we've talked about bureaucracy or setting up these systems to help run large government. And so they're going to run into these Christian kids, these highly talented or the smart Christian children from these conquered provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and they will incorporate these Christian children into the Ottoman Empire's bureaucracy and make them become professionals. And then they send them back to Turkey, and they're raised as Muslims. Then they'll run the bureaucracies as they grow up. So that's the smart, intelligent Christian children they run across will be incorporated into the bureaucracy. But then you have the Janissary Corps, which are recruits or the less bright Christian children. And so the Janissary Corps are those Christian slaves who were not selected for the Ottoman bureaucracy. So you can imagine, like, I wasn't the bright one, but instead served loyally in the Turkish army. And so the Ottoman Empire will incorporate these conquered children into these 2 different areas to help serve the empire. And the Ottoman Empire was actually fairly tolerant regarding religion in its conquered provinces. It will divide into millets or nations and allow autonomous self-rule, so you could keep your religion, and that helped keep such a large empire together that had been built on expansion. But then as we see Austria and Russia starting to move in, that's going to start to disintegrate. And so then finally our last of hop is going to be Poland. And so Poland had what was called a liberum veto, meaning I freely forbid. And so voting in Polish parliament had to be unanimous for changes to be made. And so a liberum veto means anyone can object. So even if one person stands up, they can object and no law can be passed. So we see very little can be done to systematically strengthen the kingdom because it only takes one person to stand up and say, I disagree, and it can't pass. And so we're going to see other places that will be the second part of this review. Russia and Prussia are going to encourage certain members to invoke the liberum veto to weaken Poland. So they'll actually send people in to object to things, to keep things from moving in. And by 1800, Poland is actually going to cease to exist as a sovereign state. It will be carved up by Russia, Austria, and Prussia, or our wrap, as we're getting ready to discuss. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how Eastern absolutism differs from French absolutism so we can kind of set up how things are moving along with our new empires. So, no worries if I left you hanging. Poland will be back, but Eastern European absolutism, we're going to shift gears for a second, different from French absolutism. Eastern absolutism is going to be based off of a powerful nobility, a weak middle class, and an oppressed peasantry composed of serfs. And it's going to show a total exploitation of peasants as we talk about Eastern absolutism. If you remember, in Western Europe, the nobility is weak, and the middle class is strong. But in Eastern absolutism, we're going to see a powerful nobility, so a stark difference here, and a weak middle class, whereas the middle class is strong in the West and an oppressed peasantry. In France, the nobility's power had been limited, the middle class was relatively strong, and peasants were generally free from serfdom. Louis XIV had built French absolutism upon the foundations of a well-developed medieval monarchy and a strong royal bureaucracy. And so we're going to see that you need to track the differences here, especially pertaining to nobility, middle class, and peasantry or serfdom as we move into Eastern absolutism. We also need to note here the cause or the reasons behind the development or consolidation of power in Eastern European monarchs. So many invasions were happening, or so many threats of war with European and Asian invaders were the important motivations for Eastern European monarchs' drive to consolidate power. When there are wars or invasions, the king can ask for more and more power. Or more and more powers that the government held and not the king. And so we're going to see that these invasions and war are going to result in reduced political power of the nobility. However, as I mentioned, one of the differences between Western and Eastern Europe is that nobles will gain much greater power over the peasantry. In Eastern Europe, we're going to see that the nobility makes a deal with the king, like I will hold serfs and keep them down, like you let me have my power over serfs, and I will help you get power. Three important methods of gaining absolute power in Eastern Europe were that kings imposed and collected permanent taxes without the consent of their subjects. States maintained permanent standing armies. States conducted relations with other states as they pleased. And absolutism in Eastern Europe is going to reach its height with Peter the Great of Russia, where we'll finish this review video. And we're going to see that absolutism in Prussia is going to be much more stronger than it is in Austria. And so just one more topic to cover, serfdom, before we move into our three new rising empires. And so one of the biggest differences in absolutism in Eastern Europe is that there's serfdom in Eastern Europe and none in Western Europe. After 1300, lords in Eastern Europe revived serfdom to combat increasing economic challenges. The areas most affected in Eastern Europe include Bohemia, Silesia, Hungary, Eastern Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Labor shortage means that the nobles are going to demand people to stay and work, which is totally opposite of Western Europe. We're going to see that the drop in population in the 14th century, especially from the Black Death, instead of kind of flipping the social scale like it did in Western Europe, is going to create this tremendous labor shortage and hard times for the nobles, but that will then cause serfdom to stay, where we saw feudalism fall in Western Europe. So the lords are going to demand that their kings and princes issue laws restricting or eliminating peasants' right of moving freely. By 1500, Prussian territories had laws requiring runaway peasants to be hunted down and returned to their lords. Serfs were hunted down. You would have your ear then nailed to a post. And when you wanted to be free, then you would have to cut your own ear off. So it made a very big statement of how held down the serfs were in Eastern Europe. Laws were passed that froze peasants in their social class, so there was no upward mobility, like we saw some upward mobility in Western Europe. Lords confiscated peasant land and imposed heavier labor obligations. The legal system will become monopolized by the local lord. And we're going to see that non-serf peasants were also affected. Robot is what it is called in certain regions. Peasants were required to work 3 to 4 days without pay per week for their local lord. So even if you weren't a serf, peasants then were tied, where we're going to see not at all in Western Europe. So free peasants were still affected. Serfdom is going to be consolidated between 1500 and 1650, and then hereditary serfdom will be reestablished in Poland, Russia, and Prussia by the mid 17th century, meaning you were born into um, conscripted serfdom. In Poland, nobles are going to gain complete control over peasants in 1574 and can legally impose death penalties on serfs whenever they wished. So it's a huge difference between the restricted power of the nobility in Western Europe. And by 1694, the Russian Tsar had rescinded a 9-year term limit on recovery of runaway serfs, so he gets rid of this rule. This period is going to see the growth of estate agriculture. We're going to see that this is not much different than slavery. Food prices are going to increase due to the influx of gold and silver from the Americas, and surpluses in wheat and timber were sold to big foreign merchants who exported them to feed the wealthier West. And so the incentive of Western capitalists was buying products equals serfdom because of this increase in gold and silver from exploration. And so why serfdom in Eastern Europe and not Western Europe? We're talking about the big difference, but we haven't really talked about why. And so the reasons for serfdom in Eastern Europe is not necessarily all economic like you would think. The West had also, as we talked about, been devastated by the Black Death, and the resulting labor shortages had actually helped the labor or laboring class there. There is more of a political reason, or that's more of a plausible reason that historians find for the rise of serfdom in Eastern Europe and the supremacy of noble landlords. Most kings, in fact, were essentially first among equals in the noble class. So in Eastern Europe, the king was just seen as like the highest ranking of the nobles and directly benefited from keeping serfdom around. So the king will willingly give power to other nobles to keep him in the highest station of nobility. We also see that the Eastern lords have more political power than in the West, and the monarchs needed the nobles in the East, unlike the monarchs in Western Europe who totally ripped the power of the nobles away, or at least tried to in every manner they could. There's no parliaments in Eastern Europe like in England, and peasants have no recourse. They have no way of rising up. Constant warfare in Eastern Europe and political chaos will result in noble landlord class increasing their political power at the expense of the monarchs, and weak Eastern kings had little power to control landlord policies aimed at peasants. Strong sovereign kings we're going to see won't be in place in Eastern Europe prior to 1650. Peasants were weaker politically in the East than in the West. Uprisings were unsuccessful. Peasant solidarity in the East was weaker than Western communities. They were all kind of fighting against each other and not solidified into one unit. Landlords will undermine medieval privileges of towns and the power of urban classes. The population of towns and importance of urban middle class will decline significantly, which is just directly opposite to what happened in Western Europe. So there's the overview of what's going on in Eastern Europe with our declining three, and now we're going to get into, and the differences in Western and Eastern absolutism. Now we're going to get into the rise, or our wrap, the rise of our three new empires. Okay, so now for the wrap part, but we are not going to do in order. We're going to start with Austria, the Austrian Empire, or the Habsburg Empire, what's left of it. So the rise of Austria. The ruler of Austria was traditionally selected as Holy Roman Emperor. As we saw, that was usually from the Habsburg family. After the War of Spanish Succession, which we talked about in video 1, and the Treaty of Utrecht, one of our key dates, 1713, the Spanish throne was now occupied by the Bourbons, or Philippe of Anjou, and Habsburg power was now only concentrated in Austria. So we're going to focus on Austria because the Habsburg power of Charles II had been taken over by the Bourbon dynasty, and we talked about how they wouldn't be allowed to unite, but Philip of Anjou, or Philip V, will then be the crown holder there. So the Habsburg power is no longer in Spain, but just concentrated in Austria. So the Austrian Habsburg Empire is going to include Naples, Sardinia, and Milan in Italy, the Austrian Netherlands, or Belgium, and Hungary and Transylvania, or modern-day Romania. So as we have discussed, the ineffective Habsburg rule of Charles II in the Holy Roman Empire forced monarchs to turn their attention inward and eastward to consolidate their diverse holdings into a strong, unified state. So in 1657 to 1718, as we saw, they were trying to unite and re-Catholicize, but now, having lost that with the ineffective rule of the Habsburgs, they have to turn their attention to Austria. And so we'll see the reorganization of Bohemia was a major step towards absolutism. So I like to think of this mnemonic device with the Habsburgs, Habspurgs, Hungary, Austria, Bohemia, will come together to be what is the Austrian Empire. The Czech Bohemian nobility was wiped out during the Bohemian phase of the 30 Years' War, and Ferdinand II had totally wiped out the Protestant nobility, which gives him land in he will start to give it to people on his side. So he starts redistributing Czech lands to the aristocratic soldiers from all over Europe, and conditions for serfs will decline. The old hereditary provinces of Austria proper, now we're going to see with the conditions for serfs declining, you are noble, you owe everything to the king, and that's that contract we're kind of talking about with the difference between Western and Eastern absolutism. So these old hereditary provinces of Austria proper were centralized by Ferdinand III from 1637 to 1657, and Ferdinand will create a permanent standing army. Unprecedented for the Habsburg Empire. So we're going to see just this little remainder of the Habsburg Empire get back on its feet. Hungary will be the third and largest part of its dominion. So remember, Hungary, Austria, Bohemia is the HAB and Habsburgs. And this is going to be fought over by the Habsburgs and Turk, who will kind of overlap with Louis XIV that we talked about in video 1. The Magyars will become the dominant cultural group in Hungary, and serfdom will intensify in Habsburg lands. So again, that difference between Eastern and Western absolutism is the use of serfdom. So the Austrian Empire is not like other empires. There's some big differences we need to talk to with the emergence of the Austrian Empire here. So government of the Austrian Empire, Austria was not a national state. It was very multinational, and its empire included Austria proper, the Germans and Italians, Bohemia, the Czechs, and Hungary, which were the Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, and Romanians. So different languages, customs, and histories is going to equal a challenge for the Austrian Empire. There was no single constitutional system or administration in the empire, as each region had a different legal relationship to the emperor. So these are some challenges faced by the Austrian Empire. So we won't see it a consolidated nation really like the other European powers that we've discussed. But there are some important Habsburg rulers to discuss here. They're kind of, you're going to see in the pictures, look like the Spanish Habsburgs, which is not really a good thing. And so by resemblance here, I mean, look at that chin. We can see some resemblance of the family line here. Ferdinand II, 1619 to 1637, is going to take control of Bohemia during the 30 Years' War, as I mentioned just a couple minutes earlier. And then Ferdinand III, ruling from 1637 to 1657, is going to centralize the government in the old hereditary provinces of Austria proper. And then we'll get to Leopold I, who is a Catholic. And there's that chin again. So Leopold I, 1658 to 1705, Catholic, and a severely restrict Protestant worship. He's going to lay the siege of Vienna and successfully repel the Turks from the gates of Vienna in 1683. This is the last time, or the last attempt by the Ottoman Empire to take Central Europe. And so that's where we talked about the fall of the Hop of the Ottoman Empire. They're losing that expansionism there. And then in 1697, Prince Eugene of Savoy is going to lead Austria's forces to a victory over the Ottomans at Zenta, thus securing Austria from future Ottoman attacks. So we start to see Austria rise and the Ottoman Empire disintegrate. And so then, if you remember from earlier lectures, we had seen Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, divide the Habsburg territories between Philip and then his other son, and so we saw the Spanish Netherlands. But then anyway, Emperor Charles VI will come along 1711 to 1740, and Austria will actually be saved from French expansion during the War of Spanish Succession that we just talked about in video 1, with its alliance with Britain and the military leadership of Prince Eugene. And we're going to see that Emperor Charles VI then issues the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713, so the same year as the Treaty of Utrecht, so it's kind of a side key date, and he's really doing what he has to do to be successful. And in this, Habsburg possessions were never to be divided and henceforth to be passed intact to a single heir. And so in the Pragmatic Sanction, he's saying a single heir. We can't keep splitting what's left of this Habsburg Empire up. It has to go to a single heir. And so He doesn't have a son, so this will actually pass on to his daughter, Maria Theresa, and she will inherit Charles's empire in 1740 and rule for 40 years. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But next, we need to move into our next rising empire in Rap, which is Prussia. And so where Austria had been the Habsburgs and Prussia, we're going to see the House of Hohenzollern. Um, and so a brief background on Brandenburg, which you can see kind of is the light, really light purple on this map. The Brandenburg is actually Prussia, but the ruler of Brandenburg was designated as one of the 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire in 1417. So Brandenburg is where modern day Berlin is. And so by the 17th century, Brandenburg was not significantly involved in Holy Roman Empire affairs. Marriages had increasingly given the Hohenzollerns control of German principalities in central and western Germany, and this is how they expand and create Prussia. The prince actually had little power over the nobility, but we're going to see that he's going to get more. So Brandenburg plus Prussia is going to equal one united empire in 1618, and this is where we're going to get all of those Fredericks that our group 3 told us about. So Frederick William, our first Frederick William, the Great Elector, 1640 to 1688. Background on him, he was a strict Calvinist, but he granted religious toleration to Catholics and Jews. He admired the Swedish system of government and the economic power of the Netherlands. But he is going to have an ongoing struggle or the ongoing struggle between Sweden and Poland for control of the Baltic after 1648 and the wars of Louis XIV had created an atmosphere of permanent crisis. Prussia will be invaded in 1656 to 1657 by the Tartars of southern Russia, who killed or carried off as slaves more than 50,000 people. In Prussia, this invasion will weaken the noble estates and strengthen the urgency of the electors' demands for more money and a larger army. So as we talked about earlier, these invasions and wars in Eastern Europe are going to allow the Eastern kings, or no, the Eastern, as we're going to see, czars, come to more power or to create more power for themselves. A little bit different than in Western Europe. Prussian nobles are going to refuse to join representatives of towns in resisting royal power. So we see a difference in the nobility there again in Eastern Europe. So Frederick William the Great Elector is going to establish Prussia as a great power and lay the foundation for the future unification of Germany in the 19th century. So he's very important to that. Most significant thing he did is he oversaw the Prussian militarism and created the most efficient army in Europe. He had 30,000 in his army with a population of 1 million. He employed military power and taxation to unify his Rhine holdings, Prussia and Brandenburg, into a strong state. And he is going to increase military spending achieved through heavy taxes. He's actually going to be able to create twice the amount of military spending of that of Louis XIV in France. The Prussian nobility were not exempted. So this is different than France. The nobility were not exempted in Prussia from taxation for the military, and soldiers are also going to serve as tax collectors and policemen, thus expanding the government's bureaucracy. So you see a little similarity there with the use of bureaucracy to create control. So nobles in Prussia are called Junkers, and they form the backbone of the Prussian military officer corps. These nobles and landowners dominated the estates of Brandenburg and Prussia, and in 1653, hereditary subjugation of serfs was established as a way of compensating the nobles for their support to the crown. So one of those big differences of absolutism in Eastern Europe is serfs are held down in return for the support of the nobility. So the nobility gets to control the serfs, and they give then heightened power then to our crown. He is going to encourage also industry and trade and import skilled craftsmen and Dutch farmers. He's going to create new industries such as woolens, cotton, linens, velvet, lace, silk, soap, paper, and iron products. And his efforts at overseas trade, however, are going to largely fail due to Prussia's lack of ports and naval experience. And that's going to bring us up to our next Frederick, Frederick I, or Elector Frederick III, the ostentatious, the first king of Prussia. He was the most popular of the Hohenzollern kings, and he sought to imitate the court of Louis XIV. He encouraged higher education and even founded a university and encouraged the founding of an academy of science, and he welcomed immigrant scholars. He fought in 2 wars against Louis XIV during those Wars of Louis to preserve the European balance of power. If you remember, Prussia was part of the War of the League of Augsburg and the War of the Spanish Succession. He allied with the Habsburgs during this time, and the Elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, was now recognized internationally because of this involvement in the League of Augsburg and the War of Spanish Succession as the King of Prussia. Therefore, Frederick I becomes the first King of Prussia in return for aid to the Habsburgs. And that brings us up to another Frederick, like there weren't enough, Frederick William I, or the Soldiers' King. So Frederick William I, 1713 to 1740 was his ruling dates, was the most important Hohenzollern regarding the development of Prussian absolutism. This is where this really kicks off. He was a Calvinist like his father, but he had kind of an odd obsession with finding tall soldiers for his army. He was very disciplined, carried a stick very into military. He always wore a military uniform. It was said that beautiful young girls had nothing on soldiers, like he would much rather see a very tall soldier than any beautiful young lady. He had these tall soldiers painted them and have them march around his bedroom, so a little obsessed. He hated too fancy of dressed women. Like, he was just very into this, militaristic kind of oddness. He's going to become very old and mean, and we'll talk about that towards the end of his rule, but very obsessed with tall soldiers. He's going to infuse militarism into all of Prussian society, and it'll become known as the Sparta of the North. So if you know about Sparta in Greece, like tall, just all about soldiers, all about soldier training. One noble diplomat said Prussia is not a state with an army, but an army with a state. Society is going to become very rigid and highly disciplined. Unquestioning obedience was the highest virtue during his time period in most militaristic society of modern times. This is where we kind of get the stereotype of a German with that unquestioned obedience, like you just listen to the state or the ruler of the state. Frederick William I is going to nearly double the size of the army. It will be the best army in Europe and Europe's 4th largest army next to France, Russia, and Austria. 80% of government revenues went towards the military, and the Prussian army was designed to avoid war through deterrence. The only time Frederick William I fought a war was when Sweden occupied a city in northern Germany, and he will subsequently force the Swedes out. He had the most efficient bureaucracy in Europe. He removed the last of the parliamentary estates and local self-government. He demanded absolute obedience and discipline from civil servants, and he promoted based upon merit, so meritocracy. Some commoners were able to rise to positions of power under Frederick William I, but he had very high levels of taxation. So the Junkers, or the Prussian nobility, are going to remain the officers' caste in the army in return, again, that return for supporting the king's absolutism. And he is going to establish compulsory elementary education in 1717 and establish approximately 1,000 schools for peasant children. And here's that direct quote: "The most beautiful girl or woman in the world would be a matter of indifference to me, but tall soldiers, they are my weakness." So just imagine that, and then the marching of soldiers around in his bedroom. But just an odd little fact about him: the Soldiers' King. We'll come back to Frederick II or Frederick the Great, that will rule right after Frederick William I, 1740 to 1786, and the Enlightened Despots that we're going to talk about, because he's the most powerful and famous of the Prussian kings, but we need to talk about the Enlightenment before we can get to Enlightened Despots. But he's coming up if you were wondering where he went. And so now finally the R in our wrap, Russia. So historical background of Russia: during the Middle Ages, the Greek Orthodox Church, which we talked about, that split that had happened as a church as the Byzantine Empire had formed, will become the significant force here in assimilating Scandinavian descendants of the Vikings with the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. Also an influence of Russia was the Mongols. From the 13th century, they had invaded Eastern Europe and ruled the Eastern Slavs for over 2 centuries. The Russians became accustomed to this authoritarian Mongol rule, or what they called the Mongol yoke. If you think about a yoke that's like on an oxen, of like holding them down, which was led by the Mongol Khan. Khan is the leader of the Mongols. So this Mongolian rule will leave a legacy of ruthless leadership that would continue in Russia in future centuries. They get used to this ruthless authoritarian rule, and that's going to set us up for some strong, powerful rule by our czars. Eventually, princes of Moscow who served under the Khan because the empire was so vast they needed help ruling, began to consolidate their own rule and will replace Mongol power. And this is where we're going to get to Ivan the First and Ivan the Third, who are the most important of these princes, who are going to initially start ruling to aid the Khan, but then take over. Muscovy, which is like the nucleus of what will become Russia, is going to begin to emerge as the most significant principality that formed in this time period. However, the Russian nobles, which are called boyars, so you have the boyars in Russia and the Junkers in Prussia, so keep those straight. And the free peasantry are going to make it difficult for the Muscovite rulers to strengthen the state. So we're going to see some opposition by the nobility and the peasantry to allow these Roman princes to rise up. And so they're going to have to create that deal we talked about with Eastern absolutism, where there's a deal between the king and the nobility to hold down the peasantry. So this is going to play out in Russia as well, as we'll see. And that's going to bring us to our early rulers of Russia, our first being Ivan the Third, or Ivan the Great. So Ivan the Great in 1480 is going to end that Mongol domination of Muscovy that's been there since the 13th century. He's going to push the Mongols out, therefore establishing himself as the hereditary ruler of Muscovy. This was in response to the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1553 and his desire to make Moscow the new center of the Orthodox Church, or what he would call the Third Rome, now that Constantinople isn't. So the Byzantine Empire's fall, and Constantinople was the second Rome. So you have the first Rome, of course, is Rome. The second is Constantinople. And now Ivan the Great wants to make the third Rome Moscow. He is going to then create where the Tsar becomes the head of the church, and he's going to call it Holy Russia, therefore emphasizing again what is known as the Third Rome. He was actually married to the daughter of the last Byzantine emperor, so there's kind of this connection between Constantinople and Moscow, so the Second Rome and Third Rome. He is going to also create the title of Tsar, which comes from Rome, or the Caesars. So you'll see it T-S-A-R, C-Z-A-R, but Tsars comes from that absolute ruling in Rome. And so therefore, the Tsar is going to claim his absolute power was derived from the divine right as ruler. So we'll again see divine right, head of church, appointed by God. Ivan, however, is going to struggle with the Russian boyars, which is the Russian nobility, for power. Eventually, however, the boyars' political influence will decrease, but they began exerting more control over the peasants. And so that's where we're going to start to see that contract between the king and the nobility, allowing them to hold the peasantry down and having them give the king more power, so making that agreement with the Tsar. Ivan is actually going to start to take land and execute boyars and then kind of give that land to people who supported him. And so we're going to see that as we move into Ivan the Terrible, that practice continue on. So trying to suppress the nobility, but nothing like the suppression in Western Europe. So Ivan the Fourth, or Ivan the Terrible. A little background: he was the grandson of Ivan III. He comes to the throne at 3 years old. His mom dies when he's 8. And so we're going to see some similarities between Louis XIV here. The boyars, or the nobility, are going to try to dominate him when he is just a boy, because his grandpa had tried to limit their power. And so he's going to have this distaste for the nobility as well. He's actually the first to take the title of Tsar or Caesar, and he's going to marry a Romanov, which is going to become the later rulers of Russia for the next 300 years. So this becomes very important. This is where the Romanov line starts in Russian history. Under Ivan the Terrible, we're going to see territorial expansion. He's going to control the Black Sea region, and this becomes that obsession with a port, or a warm water port. He's going to gain huge territories in the Far East and push the Mongols back, and gain territories in the Baltic region. He's also going to begin the westernization of Muscovy and encourage trade with England and the Netherlands. And for 25 years, he is going to fight some unsuccessful wars against Poland and Lithuania. But military obligations are going to deeply affect both nobles and peasants. The nobles are going to get to keep their land for military obligation, and the peasants are just going to keep their life for serving in the military. A lot of these kings used this to consolidate the power in their own country, use these wars to consolidate, even though they're unsuccessful, but to consolidate their own power, as we talked about in Eastern Europe. The wars during Ivan the Terrible's reign are going to leave much of Central Europe depopulated. And this is where we get the Cossacks. They're peasants who fled to the west, to the newly conquered Muscovite territories in the east, and formed free groups and outlaw armies. They were kind of like outlaw armies against the Tsar, and so we'll talk about them as we move forward as well. But the Cossacks are peasants who are going to create these little, like, I'm against the whole Russian, the Muscovy state. But also, so there's the peasantry. We're going to see the reduced power of the boyars under Ivan the Terrible. Remember, he too had been affected by kind of those boyars trying to take over when he's a boy. So he's going to have all nobles serve the Tsar in order to keep their lands. He's going to increase serfdom substantially to keep peasants tied to noble lands. And during this time period of his rule, many nobles will be executed. Ivan is actually going to become pretty paranoid and obsessed with the boyars. He's going to blame them for his wife's death. He thinks there's all these conspiracies, like from what they did when he was a child, to try to take him out, make his cousin the Tsar. He thinks that they poisoned his wife, and thus he becomes increasingly cruel and demented. He's going to go even a step further than others, in that merchants and artisans were also bound to their towns, so the Tsar could more effectively tax them. And what this is going to do is it's going to contrast the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe, where merchants gain influence and more security over private property. There's going to be no bourgeoisie rise in Eastern Europe like there was in Western Europe. And Ivan's rule is going to get even more erratic. He's going to go from like mass orgies one week to prayer and fasting the next, so really erratic and up and down. He's even known for throwing cats and dogs out the window of the Kremlin, or the government building. And then in 1581, his daughter-in-law is pregnant, and he thinks she's been dressing immodestly, so he goes from like orgies to then you're not dressing modest enough, and he beats her, which causes a miscarriage, therefore of course angering his son. And so he and his son get into this huge fight, and he is actually going to take a cane, and in the course of this fight, actually beat his son to death. So in a fit of rage one moment, killing his son, and then completely remorseful about it the next, just shows his up and down. But really why we're even talking about this is this leaves him with no heir. His son is dead, his grandson is dead, and then Ivan is going to die while playing chess. And actually in the 1960s, they're going to dig up his body and find that he had a large amount of mercury in his blood. So there could have been, some kind of poisoning assassination plot, or there's a theory that when he was a child, he got very sick, and that mercury was given as a cure, and then finally he got sick again in his old age, and then it was this fatal dose of mercury, which may have explained some of the erratic behavior. But anyway, the real importance of this is going to cause what is known as the Time of Trouble following Ivan IV's death in 1584. Because there's no heir, his family begins to fight over power. There's going to be this period of famine, power struggles, and war. The Cossacks are going to Cossack bands are going to travel north, massacring nobles and officials. They say they want a true Tsar, someone who will give them power and reduce taxes. Sweden and Poland are actually going to be able to take Moscow in this time period, which is going to prompt, they're like, oh, whoa, we have all these problems, but a bigger problem is foreign people taking over our lands. So in response to this conquest by Sweden and Poland, the nobles are going to elect Ivan's grandnephew as a new hereditary Tsar and rally around him to drive out these invaders. And this hereditary Tsar is going to be the beginning of our Romanov dynasty. It's going to last from the ascent of Michael Romanov, who's the grandnephew of Ivan, in 1613, all the way up to the Russian Revolution in 1917, where we're going to see Russia become a communist country, or the Soviet Union. And so Michael Romanov, 1613 to 1645, is going to actually favor the nobles in return for their support. He's much nicer to the nobles than Ivan. He's going to reduce their military obligations significantly. He's going to expand the Russian Empire all the way to the Pacific Pacific Ocean in the Far East. He's going to also, however, fight several unsuccessful wars against Sweden, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire, but remember, those wars were used to consolidate power within the state. Russian society is going to continue to transform in the 17th century. We're going to see influence of the West here under Michael Romanov. Nobles are going to gain more exemptions from military service, but the rights of peasants are going to decline even more. It's going to become oppressive and extreme serfdom. A bloody Cossack revolt is going to result in further restrictions on serfs. We're also going to see challenges with the church here. The old believers of the Orthodox Church are going to resist the influx of new religious sects from the West, such as Lutherans and Calvinists. So while the Romanovs, while Michael is letting in these influences from the West, and I think he's trying to change the church a little bit, like in a song called Hallelujah, not like the Hallelujah you think today, but he said it once, he's going to say, let's repeat it twice. And all of these old Orthodox members are, like you can't change the church. And actually in protest, 20,000 of them are going to burn themselves to death over 20 years. These are what are called old believers, were severely persecuted by the Romanov government, by Michael's government. And Western ideas are going to continue to gain ground. Western books will be translated into Russian. New skills in technology, clothing, and customs, such as men trimming their beards, will begin. The first Russian translation of the Bible began in 1649. And by 1700, 20,000 Europeans lived in Russia. And by 1689, Russia was the world's largest country, 3 times the size of Europe. And some of the main feature of this lecture, and the individual that you also wrote your essay over, Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725. His half-sister Sophia actually ruled as his regent early on, but she doesn't want to relinquish power when it's time for him to rule, so she has a plot to kill him, and it fails, and he ultimately has her banished to a monastery, where then his mother, Natalia, took over as his regent. Peter and his half-brother, Ivan, began ruling in their own right when Peter was 22, so just like Louis XIV at 22. Peter was actually nearly 7 feet tall and so strong it was said that he could bend a horseshoe like back out of its shape with his bare hands. So, Frederick would have been really impressed with this, the soldier king. He also faced, and you mentioned in your essay, a revolt as a child. He is actually on a trip to Western Europe before he becomes this powerful czar, and he's a young man, and he has to come back as a result of this revolt of the Streltsky, which is the palace guard. In 1698, the Moscow guards, the Streltsky, had overthrown previous leaders, so it's like kind of the people with the weapons, watch out for them. But Peter returns, and he is going to totally defeat this revolt in 1698, and he is going to participate in personally interrogating and killing those involved. And so if you can think about this 7-foot guy, so what this really does is it solidifies the security of his reign. It's intact. He's put this down, and not only did he put it down, he went in and interrogated and killed the revolters himself, and so solidifying his rule. Military power was Peter's greatest concern. Each Russian village was required to send recruits for the Russian army for 25-year enlistments. And so not every family, but each village was required to send a certain amount of recruits. 75% of the national budget was spent on the military by the end of Peter's reign. It was paid with what he called soul tax. So instead of a land tax, you paid for each soul, S-O-U-L. The Royal Army of over 200,000 men plus an additional 100,000 special forces of Cossacks and foreigners were in the military. He's going to establish royal military and artillery academies to learn these militaristic skills. All young male nobles or boyars were required to leave home and serve 5 years of compulsory education. And he is going to have a large navy built on the Baltic, though it's going to actually decline after his death. And non-nobles are going to have opportunities to rise up the ranks, so a meritocracy as well. The Great Northern War between 1700 and 1721 is Russia, and allied with Russia is Poland, Denmark, and Saxony, versus Sweden under Charles the 12th. The Battle of Poltava was the most decisive battle in the Russians defeating Sweden. So we're not going to talk about everything that happened, but what you need to know is that the Battle of Poltava was the most decisive in allowing Russia to defeat Sweden, and the Swedish king will be exiled. The Swedes had actually been winning earlier, but Peter learns from his mistakes, and he starts to come back and starts a tactic that's going to be used over and over and over again in Russia, and that is pooling people in, pulling the Swedes in to Russia and making them rough out the winter. And so we'll see this happen with Napoleon coming up shortly, and then Hitler, and this has started with Peter the Great. The Treaty of Nystad, Russia is going to gain Latvia and Estonia and gain its window on the west in the Baltic Sea. So this means that he has made a water route to the Atlantic. Remember that port importance that we talked about. Modernization and westernization are Peter's major focuses. As you can see, this statue of Peter, he is gazing to the west. He, as I mentioned, traveled to the west as a young man to study its technology and culture. He took an 18-month tour of capitals of the west, trying to be disguised as a commoner, but he was like 7 foot tall. Military technology was his primary concern, and he is going to import to Russia substantial numbers of Western technicians and craftsmen to aid in the building of large factories. By the end of his reign, Russia is going to outproduce England in iron production, though Sweden and Germany produced more. Industrial form of serfdom existed in factories where workers could be bought and sold. We're going to see state-regulated monopolies created, which echoed the mercantilist policies of Western Europe, like in France. But it's going to have a counter effect in Russia. It's actually going to stifle economic growth. And since the serfs were pretty much slaves in the industry, they created inferior products, because why would you want to really work your butt off? You're a slave. You can be sold and bought. We're also going to see culture, that the dress, that continued with the not shaving. If you didn't shave, because he thought, look, in the West they don't shave they shave and don't have these beards like we do. You had to pay a beard tax. No veils for women. He's going to change the calendar to the Julian calendar, with January 1st being the first day of the year, and the year starting with the birth of Christ. So making some changes there. Government is going to become more efficient under Peter. He is going to rule by decree. This is an example of his absolute power. The Tsar theoretically owned all land in the state. Nobles and peasants then had to serve the state. There were no representative political bodies. There's no parliament, no estates general like we saw in Western Europe. All landowners owned lifetime service to the state, either in the military, civil service, or court. In return, they gained greater control over the serfs. So then again, there's that contract between the king and the nobility. The table of ranks is going to set educational standards for civil servants. Peter is going to seek to replace the old boyar nobility with new service-based nobility loyal to the Tsar. So this is kind of like in France, where they replaced the nobility of the sword with the nobility of the robe. He's going to have a Russian secret police that ruthlessly and efficiently crushed opponents of the state. His taxes are going to be heavy on trade sales and rent. There was a head tax on every male, and he is going to turn the Orthodox Church into a government department in 1700. So there's just similarities between absolutism. What challenges your power? The church. Take control of it. What challenges your power? Although the nobility dealt with totally different in Eastern Europe than Western Europe. And then St. Petersburg, like Louis' Versailles, is going to be Peter's window on the west. He's going to make St. Petersburg the capital. And as you can see up on the map, here, St. Petersburg, you can travel out right to the Atlantic Ocean, and so it's his window on the west, or his port. It's one of his crowning achievements. He sought to create a city similar to Amsterdam and his palace, the Peterhof, with the grandeur of Versailles. By his death, the city will be the largest in Northern Europe, 75,000 inhabitants, and it will become the capital of Russia and cosmopolitan in character, meaning it's a blend of all different peoples. Construction of Peterhof will begin in 1703, and labor was conscripted, meaning forced. He ordered many noble families to move to the city and build their homes according to Peter's plan. So if you had this many serfs, you had to build a home this large. Merchants and artisans also ordered to live in the city and help build it. The peasants were conscripted or forced into heavy labor in the city's construction. 25,000 to 40,000 people were forced to work in the summer with no pay, and there's a heavy death toll, perhaps 100,000 peasants dying in the construction. However, Peter's reforms are going to modernize Russia and bring it closer to the European mainstream. He's going to have a more modern military and state bureaucracy. There's going to be the emerging concept of interest in the state as separate from the Tsar's interest, and the Tsar is going to begin issuing explanations to his decrees to gain popular support. And so that's where we'll leave off with Eastern absolutism in our review, and pick up with Amadeus, our test, and getting ready for the scientific revolution and enlightenment overview, and then head on into the French Revolution and the reactions to absolutism in Western Europe.